Mr. May, one of the arguments that is made about the deployment of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is that we're not in an emergency. What does the airline industry have as a response to that assertion?
Mr. Chairman, I think there are at least 32,000 families who have had a breadwinner that's lost a job in my industry that would suggest this is absolutely an emergency. I would suggest all of those communities that are losing service, the people who can't move as efficiently and rapidly around the country, would suggest this is an emergency. I support the continued use of the SPRO. I think from a strategic, tactical perspective, it's important. But I think there are also times when it ought to be used to address the economic emergency that exists in this country. And so I would suggest to you there is ample reason to have a controlled release.
Mr. Rome, Mr. Simpson, you both worked at the Department of Energy. Does the economic condition that we are now being confronted with qualify under the law as a situation where the President could deploy the Strategic Petroleum Reserve? Mr. Simpson?
Under the law, the definition of is really somewhat vague. It can be interpreted in many different ways. There is a strong reluctance to use economic concerns. But the definition of an emergency as a result of inadequate supplies can be fairly broad. And the flexibility that the Secretary has to do emergency or test drawdowns, test sales, different types of things is fairly discretionary. So if Mr. May's definition of an emergency is people losing jobs, I think that could be part of the definition.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Rome?
Absolutely. I would also add that if you had described current conditions today to us in the Clinton administration and said, would you release the SPRO now, I think everybody absolutely would have. I mean, we debated it under a situation that was far more mild than it is today.
That's true. Mr. Simpson, what are the, if any, operational obstacles to the deployment of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in the shot run?
I don't think there are any operational obstacles to releasing it. The implications of an exchange that I talked about would be actually positive in the long term for the reserve, because we would begin to make the capacity of the oil in the reserve more reflect the 40% of the refining industry's use of heavy oil. I think we're in jeopardy here. We got a hurricane coming in and down in Texas. If it had turned south and gone into Mexico and disrupted some of the heavy oil production down there, we wouldn't have a way to replace that heavy oil using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
So you're saying releasing light crude now and replacing it with heavy crude is something which is consistent with industry practices and needs?
Very much so.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rome, we've already seen a disruption of heavy oil imports from Latin America under Hugo Chavez's regime in 2002. Both GAO and the Department of Energy have concluded that including some amount of heavy oil in the SPR would be wise. Do you agree with that conclusion, Mr. May, that Mr. Simpson just reached?
I'm not sure I followed the question, Mr. Chairman. Do I agree with which statement?
The statement that Mr. Simpson just made, that having more heavy crude would actually be something that could...
Yeah, I'm not an expert on heavy versus light. I can tell you this, that to the extent you're releasing light, you're making it available to all of the refineries in the United States. There are a number of refineries that cannot process heavy sour. And so replacing that with heavy sour is a perfectly sound strategy, and releasing light sweet will have the most immediate impact on the refineries all being able to use it, and for the consumer to get gasoline, Jet A, diesel fuel, et cetera.
Okay, now let me just conclude by asking this question of each of you quickly. If we did pass legislation which said to the President, deploy 10% of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve over the next 5 or 6 months without telling him which day of the week to do it. But if there was something happening in Iran or Nigeria, other parts of the world, he could deploy 1 million barrels of oil on the couple of days before or after that incident, and maybe not deploy anything for a week or so after that. Would that have, in your opinion, a downward pressure on the price of oil if the President had that authority and had to deploy 70 million barrels over a 5 or 6 month period? Mr. Simpson.
I believe it would, and in looking at the history, I think that's the case. If you add the government as a player, and there are people who advocate both sides, but if you put the government in as a player, it makes it more difficult to accurately predict, as speculators would like to do, what the oil price would be in the future.
Dr. Rome?
I would agree with that. I mean, obviously, it assumes that the President would make use of that authority. But if the President were willing to make use of the authority, I don't think it would have any question that it would have a downward pressure on prices.
Mr. May?
It would have a downward pressure.
Okay, thank you.